I'm Tim Weed, a Vermont-based writer and volunteer on the festival's author committee. And it is my distinct honor today to present two wonderful novelists, Anna North and Jim Shepard. The plan is that I will introduce the two of them and their latest books, which you can order, by the way, even while we're talking, by clicking the link in the chat to Antidote Books. Or you can buy them at your, whatever bookstore you want, but the link provides an easy way for you to do that. And then we're going to sit back and enjoy a little bit of a sample reading from each of them. And then after that, we'll have an opportunity to discuss their work, the state of literature, writing, reading, whatever else you want. And those of you who are here, welcome. And you can submit questions via the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. I will check that frequently. If a version of your question has already been submitted, you can click the thumbs up icon that will upvote the question so that we don't duplicate questions. And again, there will be links in the chat to purchase these incredible novels and also to donate to the festival. Before I forget, a special thank you to the festival's sponsors. Okay, so without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and introduce Anna and Jim. So Anna North is a journalist as well as a novelist whose journalistic work mostly focuses on reproductive health and the politics thereof. She's a senior reporter at Vox and was previously a writer and editor at the New York Times, Salon, BuzzFeed, and Jezebel. Anna grew up in Los Angeles, now lives in Brooklyn, and is a graduate of the Iowa Writers Workshop. She's the author of 3 novels, America Pacifica, The Life and Death of Sophie Stark, and her latest, Outlawed, about which Publishers Weekly wrote, North's knockout latest chronicles the travails of a midwife's daughter who joins a group of female and non-binary outlaws during the end of the 19th century, near the end of the 19th century. The character struggles for gender nonconformity and LGBTQ rights are tenderly and beautifully conveyed. This feminist Western parable is impossible to put down. And Ron Charles of the Washington Post opined, Outlawed stirs up the Western with a provocative blend of alt history and feminist consciousness. The result is a thrilling tale, eerily familiar, but utterly transformed. In North's galloping prose, it is a fantastically cinematic adventure that turns the sexual politics of the Old West inside out. Jim Shepard is the author of 7 novels and 5 story collections, including his latest collection, The World to Come. 5 of his short stories have been chosen for Best American Short Stories, 2 for Penn O. Henry Prize stories, and 1 for a Pushcart Prize. He teaches at Williams College. Jim's latest novel is Phase Six, of which Kirkus wrote, readers will find themselves in territory that feels eerily familiar: panic, politics, uncertainty, fear, a resistance to quarantine, an overload of media noise, as Shepard's command of tone never lets the tension ease. All the narrative propulsion of escapist fiction without the escape. And Anne Levin of the Associated Press called the novel stunning, a fast-paced, suspenseful story about what happens when a different microbe is unleashed on the world. While the novel is thrilling, it's less of a thriller than a love story, an ode to family, friends, lovers, hard work, and the beautiful, heartbreaking innocence of childhood. So as you can see, really, really interesting books we're going to be talking about right now. So just a quick reminder before I turn it over, I'm going to turn it over to Anna first, but a quick reminder, check the chat. In the chat, you will find links to purchase the books. And if you have any questions at any time, just put them in the Q&A, and toward the end, we'll make sure that we get to any questions that you have. So it's my pleasure to introduce Anna North.
Thanks so much. I'm excited to be here, even if virtually. I was sad not to be able to come to Vermont, but I actually did my first in-person reading a couple weeks back, and I felt like I freaked out and did a terrible job. So this is like what I'm comfortable with now. This is the world we live in. Hopefully I won't freak out this time. But anyway, thanks again. And I'm going to read from the very beginning of Outlawed. So it's the cover, but you don't need to know anything because it's just the very start. Okay. In the year of our Lord, 1894, I became an outlaw. Like a lot of things, it didn't happen all at once. First, I had to get married. I felt lucky on the day of my wedding dance. At 17, I wasn't the first girl in my class to marry, but I was one of them, and my husband was a handsome boy from a good family. He had 3 siblings like me, and his mama was one of 7. Did I love him? We used to say we loved our beaus, my girlfriends and I. I remember spending hours talking about his broad shoulders, his awkward but charming dancing, the bashful way he always said my name. The first few months of my marriage were sweet ones. My husband and I were hungry for each other all the time. In 9th form, when the girls and boys were separated to prepare us for married life, Mrs. Spencer had explained to us that it would be our duty to lie with our husbands regularly so that we could have children for baby Jesus. We already knew about the children part. We had read Burton's Lessons of the Infant Jesus Christ every year since 3rd form, so we had heard about how God sent the great flu to cleanse the world of evil, just like he'd sent the flood so many centuries before. We knew that baby Jesus had appeared to Mary of Texarkana after the sickness had killed 9 of every 10 men, women, and children from Boston to California, and struck a covenant with her. If those who remained were fruitful and peopled the world in his image, he would spare them further sickness, and they and their descendants forever after would be precious to him. But in 9th form, we learned about lying with our husbands, how we should wash beforehand and put perfume behind our ears, how we should breathe slowly to relax our muscles and try to look our husbands in the eyes, how we'd bleed. Don't worry, she said then, smiling at us. It only hurts in the beginning. After a while, you'll start to like it. There's nothing more joyful than 2 people joining together to make a child. My husband did not know what to do at first, but he took his responsibility seriously, and what he lacked in experience, he made up for in ardor. We lived with his parents while he saved for a house. In the mornings, his mother made little jokes about how soon I'd be eating for 2. During the day, I still attended births with my mama. I was the eldest and the only one who actually wanted to learn about breech births and morning sickness and childbed fever, so I was the one who would take over for mama when she got too old. When I came on rounds with my new wedding ring, the mothers-to-be winked and teased me. It's good you're learning about all this now, said Alma Bunting, 40 years old, pregnant with her 6th child and suffering from hemorrhoids. Then you won't be surprised when it's your turn. I just laughed. I was not like my friend Ula, who had 8 baby names picked out, 4 boys and 4 girls. When I was 10 and my sister B was 2 months old, my mama had gone to bed and stayed there for a year. So I had already been a mama. I had changed a baby, fed her from a bottle when mama couldn't nurse, soothed her at night when I was still young enough to be afraid of the dark. I was not in a rush to do it again. I knew from working with mama that sometimes it could take months, even for a young girl like me. And I was happy to sleep with my new husband and still sneak off sometimes to drink Juneberry wine behind the Petersons' barn with Ula and Susie and Mary Alice, and not have to worry about anyone except for me. I'll stop there and kick it over to Jim.
That was wonderful, Anna. Now I have to follow that. Thanks a lot. I'm also going to read from the very beginning, but I'll be skipping around a little so that if you do detect any gaps, you should imagine them filled with the kind of prose you do prefer. This is the very, very beginning of the novel. It had gotten colder overnight, and the gravediggers had had to use a pneumatic drill. Aleq had had to listen to it all morning. The Lang family all stood off to one side of the shallow hole with the coffin in it, while their kids played around the graves. Malik asked without looking up if Aleq wanted to join the club called Everyone Hates Aleq. And Aleq watched 2 3-year-olds down the hill piss on the same spot in the snow and said he was already a member. Some of the grave sites had little white fences around them, and some were just white crosses among the rocks. Some of the graves had seashells on them, and some had plastic flowers or wreaths. While the minister talked, Aleq and Malik scrolled through pictures of other people's pets and vacations. By the time the minister finished, it was sleeting. So when the service was over, a lot of people headed back to their houses, and the family almost had to fill in the grave alone. When Aleq looked back, the wind was blowing even the frozen dirt off their shovels. When he looked back again, halfway down the hill, they'd finished with the dirt and had rolled all the large stones on top and were posing for their photographs with their hoods up. An older kid named Tawik was ahead of them heading down the hill. Want to see the stupidest expression in Greenland, Malik asked him. When the kid looked up, Malik pointed at Aleq. Some 15 years earlier, the government of Greenland had announced that it had approved 4 times the number of mining exploration licenses granted in the previous decade. An Australian company had already begun zinc and lead mines on the northern coast, and 56 other active licenses were granted for gold, rubies, nickel, copper, and rare earth minerals. The mines were promoted as contributing to the green economy, since 80% of the rare earth deposits would be used in wind turbines, hybrid cars, and lasers. So the pitch became global warming in Greenland. We are part of the solution. Instead of publicizing a lot of moping and moaning Inuits trooping off to international conferences to lament the destruction of their fishing grounds, why not focus on the resources that native geologists were discovering every day under the vanishing ice sheets? Either you sat and just reacted to what was hurtling toward you, or you worked to get a hold of whatever opportunity brought along. Every settlement council had its visionaries who could anticipate hundreds of generated jobs and accompanying new airports and roads and hotels. When it was pointed out that 90% of the world's rare earth minerals came from China and that the environmental degradation that those mines had left behind was stunning, the glass half empty types were refuted with the reminder that the goal of self-sufficiency had to trump the notion of a continent changed beyond recognition, and were further chided that they couldn't live in a museum, and that the country was so huge, how could a few mines make a difference? Malik had liked what he'd seen in the new mining camp, with 3 cargo containers with doors that he and Aleq guessed were offices, and 2 tents on the bare rock around a big hole dug in the permafrost, with one of those sectional chain link fences that anyone could slide under. They visited the camp the next 4 nights, and on that 4th night, back on the dirt pile, Aleq showed Malik a rock he'd unearthed with some digging that was glassy smooth on one side from the polish Ice Age glaciers had given it 11,000 years earlier. But what had also caught Aleq's attention was a cavity where the surface had been spalled off, a scar of fractured crystals of feldspar and hornblende and ancient ice. Aleq had been taken with the contrasting textures and had brought his friend's palm over to experience the difference between polish and edge. 2 days earlier, the drill bit's relentless pounding on the rock had finally broken the chemical bonds holding it to its ledge. And when that seam had cracked and the stress boundaries had separated, a cluster of molecules that had previously thrived in the respiratory tract of an early variant of the barren goose, and that had been trapped with some throat tissue in the crystalline framework during the Holocene glaciation, had been reintroduced to the air and warming sun. And even lying there in the darkness and dirt, Aleq could smell them, like heated metal. And he had Malik smell too, those molecules that were now released to become a part of something new. I'm going to stop there. And Anna, I want to begin by asking you a question because I love your work and I'm a fan, and I would like to ask if in fact you love Charles Portis's True Grit as much as I do, and if it's one of the alternative Westerns that helped you think that your amazing thing could be done.
Thank you so much. I'm a big fan too. And great question. So I've actually still never read the book. I did see the movie when it came out and of course loved it. And it was probably in the back of my mind as I was writing. But no, I had to like really quit reading Westerns or even watching Westerns as soon as I knew I was working on a Western. So the real like proximate inspirations for this book were even sort of farther afield from the traditional Western. The biggest one was probably Crazy Cat, which let me see if I have. Yes. One of the advantages of doing this from my quote unquote home office. I've got one of my Crazy Cats here. So you can see this is like Crazy is dressed up as the sheriff for some reason. Ignatz has the brick. And I think of Crazy Cat as this really like early queer Western, right? Because it takes place in Coconino County, Arizona. There's a sheriff, there's various sort of like Western tropes. And also Crazy, sometimes Crazy is gay, sometimes Crazy is straight, sometimes Crazy is a man cat, sometimes Crazy is a lady cat. George Herriman really would not be pinned down on that. So really it was these comics that sort of made me think like, oh, the Western could sort of be this space of play. It doesn't have to be this space of hidebound tradition. If that makes sense. But now I kind of want to go back and actually read True Grit and read a lot of these now that I'm free to do so. I did watch Deadwood finally. Like as soon as I was done with copy edits, I was like, I can finally watch Deadwood. But yeah, I mean, I guess like I have a lot of pandemic questions for you, Jim, but maybe we should steer away from them for a minute. Can you talk a little bit about research for this book? Like, did you go to Greenland? Did you research about whether throat tissue could be preserved for that long? Tell me your research process here.
Wow. Yeah, I did go to Greenland. I felt like after all the reading I did about Greenland, it was still an alien enough place in lots of ways that I needed to go there just to find out what I needed to know, because I didn't even know what I needed to know in some ways. And I'm glad I went, because a lot of the accounts didn't take into account just how different it is in so many ways, and how different it has to be in so many ways. Once you decide you're going to write about a subject like this, and you decide that your patient zero is going to be an Inuit person in Greenland, you have a staggering amount of not only work but responsibility ahead of you. And then once you decide that, and you say, well, you can't be so perverse that your narrator is simply going to be a child who doesn't know what's going on, then you have all this other research, right? And in the case of your second question, essentially what I started doing was lining up CDC people and microbiologists and ER docs and telling them, the ones that would put up with me, and dumping the problem in their lap. And in the case of the molecules, it was kind of a wonderful thing, because what I've discovered over the years is if I can find the right person, I can essentially say to them something like, here's what I need. I need something that will evade detection for this long for these reasons, and the microbiologist who's just as nerdy as I am will go, what would be really cool, right? And then their wheels start turning. And then I have something that I'm being educated about that opens up all sorts of other possibilities. And you know how that operates, right?
There's such a great long tradition of ice disease in literature and film. I mean, I'm thinking about The Thing, but then there's also that great X-Files episode that's like a takeoff on The Thing.
Yeah.
And then there was just also, I can't remember if it was an American show or a Danish show. I watched so much TV in the last 2 years. It's very bad, but there's another, like that trope of the disease stuck in the ice that then escapes has become just like really entrenched.
One of those moments where sci-fi has been more than prescient, right? Because this novel came out of that story out of Siberia that you probably remember, where the boy, there's a 12-year-old boy, I think it was 6 years ago, died of anthrax.
Oh, wow.
Freaked out because there hadn't been anthrax in 100 years. And when they sent a team up to research this was in Siberia.
Yeah.
They sent a team up there, and it turned out that the boy had caught anthrax from a dead reindeer carcass that had been thawed by permafrost. And what the microbiologists have been panicked about for a while with the permafrost is, the viruses and bacterium that are in the permafrost are revivable. Viruses need to be actively revived, right? So we need a kind of Frankenstein thing for that to work. You need to have some Bond villain needs to take this stuff and make it work. But bacteria can revive by themselves. Especially bacteria that sporulate, like anthrax, and that's what they did essentially. And so, you're thinking, well, you put that together with Russia and Greenland announcing that they're going to be mining all along their top borders, and you think, well, this is millions of tons of permafrost with pathogens in it, alongside miners that are going to be flying home. So if you were trying to design a pandemic, this would be one way of doing it, essentially, right? So all of that stuff that for decades we're like, it's so cool. Imagine if there was something trapped in the ice. Duh.
Not that cool, actually, turns out. Yeah, I mean, talk to me about Tim, did you want to jump in?
No, well, just a quick question, Jim. So, do you, for microbiologists, do you consult your colleagues at Williams College, or how do you find these people?
Well, that's a great thing, right? I used to teach at Michigan, and when I wanted to find a scientist, I had to get on a bus. And I had to go to the science quad, and then I had to explain to somebody in the science quad why I wasn't a total asshole. But I'm at a liberal arts college, right? So these people are all around me. I know them. And so I can essentially say to them, when you have a minute, here's what I'd love to talk to you about.
Yeah.
So that's been a real boon for me. The liberal arts college has meant that I'm able to mix in disciplines as freely as I would like, and that's allowed me to cut all sorts of ways to research all sorts of things that otherwise I would have been wandering in the woods about.
Very cool. And go
Yeah.
ahead, you were saying something.
Oh yeah, I mean, just that made me think about doing novel research can be this sort of like fun, like alt version of journalism for me. Like I can call someone up or email them and be like, I just want to talk to you about your specialty for an hour. And I'm not gonna then put in an article, and it's not going to be controversial, and I'm not going to use your name unless you want to be named in the acknowledgements. And also I'll like pay you a consulting fee because that's not unethical.
Right.
It's very, and then people are really psyched because it's like a novel. It seems cool. I've been doing research for my next novel, and it's been like, a fun alternative to sometimes interviewing people for journalism, which they don't always want to be interviewed for.
It is interesting, that quality that we bemoan as fiction writers, which is, in America, nonfiction is taken so much more seriously. That works to our advantage, right? Because it's almost like you're saying it's off the record.
Yeah.
So I researched the Dutch water defenses for a story years ago, and I was in The Hague, and I just sent an email saying, to the ministers, would you be willing to meet with me? And all these ministers were willing to meet with me because they were like, well, this is essentially off the record.
Right.
I found myself, I continually had to say to them, that this is just for a short story, right? And don't worry about it, But if I had said, this is for the New York Times, immediately it would have been like, oh, I better not, But they were saying shocking shit. They were saying things like, we put 15 billion into this, and it's going to be obsolete in about 9 years. That's not something you tell the New York Times.
Right. That's funny. Yeah, no, people like talking about their work to novelists. I think it feels like just this like fun, organic conversation.
That's very heartening to hear, because I think we all have to.
The advantages what fiction writers have, I think.
Yeah.
Oh, I wanted to sort of ask you guys, I wanted to make sure that I had a chance to ask this question, because it seems to apply to both of your novels in different ways, that they both seem to, and I may be reading into this, but they seem to have the explicit goal of taking on the conventions of an existing genre. So the Western, or in Jim's case, maybe the apocalyptic thriller, and turning those conventions on their heads, or at least in some way transcending them. So in Jim's case, I'm thinking particularly of that phrase, escapism without the escape. I love that. And in Anna's case, these are from the critics that I was reading earlier. And in Anna's case, the phrase is a feminist Western parable and fantastically cinematic adventure that turns the sexual politics of the Old West inside out. I mean, I would imagine, I don't know how you guys feel. If I were a novelist and I was getting that kind of praise, I'd be like ecstatic. That's incredible things that people are saying, really great reactions. But what were your actual goals for these novels with regard to genre? I mean, to the degree that you can trace this, was that part of the genesis of these books?
Yeah, I mean, for me, yes. I feel like I am of like a generation and school of writers who all got pretty interested in genre pretty early and sort of have been playing with it for a long time. And I think the genres that I had been playing with prior to this novel had been like mostly sci-fi. My second novel is just a straight up realist novel that's about real people in the real world, but my first novel is kind of a dystopia. And in my short stories, such as they exist, have been a lot of sci-fi short stories, and I've always been sort of engaged in that world. And so I wanted to try something new. And I felt that the Western had not been mined as thoroughly as some other genres. It turned out that it had been mined way more thoroughly than I realized, not just with True Grit, but also like How Much of These Hills is Gold came out the year before my book, which is wonderful. And then In the Distance by Hernan Diaz, the Taya Obret novel. There's sort of like a few.
The Sisters Brothers.
The Sisters Brothers is another one. There's a few sort of alt Westerns. It's become, and I think it's sort of becoming more and more of a tradition, because you've got the There's a bunch. I'm trying to call them all up in my head. And of course, Westworld on TV, which I did permit myself to watch. But yeah, I very much wanted, just like for myself as like a fun project, I wanted to play with a Western, see if I could make it fun and engaging for me to read, and see if I could, upend a little bit the kind of cast of characters that you might see in a Western and the kinds of things that might be discussed. So yeah, on my end, short answer, yes.
Yeah, I think all the writers that I admire, Tim, and I'm trying to do this as well. If you're dealing in genre, you're trying to, on the one hand, partake of the pleasures of the genre, right? I mean, you don't want somebody reading it going, why on earth is this a Western in any way, shape, or form, right? So you're trying to partake of the pleasures of the genre. And of course, if you're working in that genre, you've gotten pleasure out of it yourself as a reader. But you're also trying to interrogate and critique those aspects of the genre that have boxed people in and sent people in some ways in the wrong directions, right? And so it's a kind of love-hate relationship, or at least a lover's quarrel, I guess is the way I would put it, right? So you're sort of going, I've always loved this genre, but I've always been annoyed with its limitations in some ways. And so, for me, the greatest cinematic Westerns are doing that as well, whether it's The Wild Bunch or whatever, right? McCabe and Mrs. Miller, pick your Western. And in this case, in the case of the apocalyptic thriller, I'd always loved those kinds of things like Michael Crichton's the Andromeda Strain, where, oh my God, everybody's been wiped out. What the hell happened, right? And that kind of almost impossible setup that is so dire has always seemed to me a very, the 10-year-old boy in me responds to it immediately. But then you say, okay, well, there's a certain limitation built into that in thematic and emotional terms. So how do you want to interrogate that? How do you want to open it up, right? So you're trying to have your cake and eat it too. And Anna's just very, very good at that, I think.
And you are too.
Yeah, so are you.
There you go. We call this log rolling 101.
Very cool. We do have a question from one of our attendees. Star asks, when you're working on your fiction that has real life issues that you care about, how do you avoid being on a soapbox? That's a good question.
Anna, do you want to start, or do you want to?
Yeah, I mean, that sort of jumps off the previous conversation, because I feel like, as you say, Jim, I think part of, the reason that you try to write in a genre or write, toward a genre or around a genre is because it's fun. The reason people read genre often is because it's fun, it's entertaining. People don't pick up Michael Crichton because they need to learn everything about real dinosaurs and like the real nuts and bolts of running a Jurassic Park. It's fun, it's exciting. So for me, like a big part of writing Outlawed certainly was, I want to write a fun Western. Yes, I would like to, again, Jim, as you put it, sort of like thinking about the thematic and emotional stakes. So I want to tell a story that is going to touch on some things that I think are of real import. I want to tell a story that, is gonna, inspire real feelings and, and touch on the real sorrow and pain of living in the world. But I also want to have like cool horse personship in it, and the kinds of like gear conversations that you can have in a Western. It was really fun for me to do all the kind of research about brands, like different kinds of brands. What are their names? What do they look like? The Fiddleback brand that plays a role in the book is actually very beautiful, and it is named after the back of a fiddle. So all that stuff, I think for me, the answer in terms of like not being didactic was just like trying to always be in touch with telling a fun and good story. And I think that's like what I try to do, I guess, in all my work, is just like be in touch with plot, be in touch with story, be in touch with like making sure the reader, or at least I, am having a good time.
Yeah, that's a nice way of putting it. And in fact, I would even go farther and say subordinate all of that soapbox stuff to plot and to narrative propulsion and to the characters' emotional agendas, right? So, if you imagine that writers are pack rats and we do all this research and we pile up all this information and we have all these little speeches that we want to give and we have all this information that we want to dump on you, it still all has to be subordinated to the demands of the narrative, so that you have a wonderful story as all the time that is never lagging. And more importantly than that, I think even the demands of the characters' emotional lives, right? So there's any amount of cool information that I dredge up that that ends up not getting into the book, not because it's not cool enough, but also because it's doing the same emotional work something else did earlier, or it's not doing any emotional work, or it's not driving the narrative forward, and so it's got to go. And that's a hard thing for writers to face, because in fact you've done all this work, you feel like you want it to pay off, it's objectively this is a cool detail, and you have to make that call, right? As Anna's saying, part of what you're doing that's pleasurable in these sorts of books is just information dumps, right? Here's what it's like to work microbiologically on a pathogen, but at some point you got to go, okay, never mind what it's like to climb into this suit. We need to be a little more worried about what's happening, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me too, it's like the story and the characters really come first. And I think to the extent that I'm ever like trying to say anything in a novel that is sort of emergent from those, and I'll end up thinking like, well, what are the implications of the story that I'm telling? Like, how do I situate this within the real world and within the world of ideas? But it always sort of starts, I think, with the story for me and with the characters.
Yeah, I think so. And I think writers have to trust that, if they're not brain dead, if their political passions, their thematic concerns are going to surface anyway. Your obsessions come forward one way or the other. So you don't need to keep worrying, am I getting my point across? Because that's not why you're constructing this in the first place.
I want to just give everybody who's watching a chance. We still have about 13 minutes or so. If you have a question, this is a really great opportunity. Maybe you're a writer yourself. Maybe you're a reader who wants to know about the process of writing these books. So scribble it in there. We'll still have a chance to do that. But meanwhile, I have sort of a question. I hope this doesn't steer it in a boring direction, but that is the question of, we've talked about how your books kind of straddle, I would say, I mean, we haven't really said this, but I would say that your books probably, they have genre elements, but they're also what maybe could be considered literary novels, right? Or serious novel, who knows what you want to call them. But does that present problems in terms of publishing, given the publishing market, or does that make it easier to publish, or does that make it harder to let's leave out to find readership for them?
When you imagine the despair that's setting in publishing houses everywhere around America, anything that will help marketing, they seize on, right? And so genre is part of that, right? Genre is simply a delivery system for narratives that have worked before, right? So there's a reason that movies are organized by genre, right? If you're going to put $50 million into a movie, you would like to know that this kind of thing made money before. Right. So publishers aren't so different from that. If Anna's publisher can say, okay, it's a Western, but get this, right? It's an alt Western. It's something for 2021, right? Now they have something they can go out and sell, right? As opposed to if you go, well, it's a little bit of everything. It's a realist novel, but it's also a time travel, but it's all, and they're like, what am I telling the sales reps? Help me out here, right? So genre is just a way of simplifying things for them. It's horror, right? Go with that. And that, anything that can help simplify, or maybe another way of putting it is cheer up the people in marketing, is probably good news. Right?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think something when people sort of first come into the world of publishing and like are disturbed by the fact that they're constantly asked to compare their books to other books, this whole concept of comps, I feel like is really, really kind of odd and itchy for debut writers, and was sort of odd for me, for my first book. Like, what is it even like? What am I supposed to say here? Who am I supposed to, and then you sort of realize it's all part of the business. I think like in my case, if I had been like, I have written a straight up Western, this is a genre, a very traditional Western, I would not in fact have been able to sell it, because Westerns are not actually popular, like just straight up Westerns are not popular and don't have a good reputation right now. Now alt Westerns are starting to, so it's become more of a thing on television. It's become more of a thing. But when you think about, like about Jim's book, or, trying to imagine the sort of like very Michael Crichton version of it is a little bit funny. And it's often, it's often like for me really hard to say where that, where that sort of literary land begins and the genre land ends. Because I think another thing about having a book come out now and having a book come out in the pandemic, and also frankly having a book come out with the sort of Reese's Book Club seal on it, was learning how many books that like might look genre-y are also very literary, so for example, like Reese chooses a lot of books that have thriller elements, but then when you look at them, maybe it shouldn't even be a but. And when you look at them, they are intricately written and beautiful and fascinating and have highly developed characters. And I think the other thing I've really learned from Bookstagram is that folks read way more widely than you would think. So there's people that are reading Jim's book that are also reading romance. There's people that are reading my book that are also reading romance. There's people reading detective stories that are also reading Proust. And I think when you sort of get into that world, which I got into much more because the pandemic kept us from bookstores and made it this way that we have to connect with readers, like I just realized how incredibly broad people's tastes are. And that, I think, in my own mind, sort of broke down some of these genre barriers. But I think Jim's absolutely right that sort of like in the publishing world, it's used to say like, these are the boxes it fits in, like boxes are important for capitalism, thus a thriller. Here you go.
Yeah.
And it's really true too that the differences between literary and popular work are really maintained only in academia and maybe in publishing itself.
Yeah.
Right? Out in the real world, if you go, that's not literature, the people look at you like, what are you talking about, right? Like I like it, I'm reading it, that kind of thing. So there's much less fretting, I think, out in the real world about where this book falls on that spectrum. In academia, that line, they're still trying to hold that line, right? That's popular culture, this is high culture. But that line is only really existing in academia. And even in academia, it's fraying now because pop culture has come in a major way in the humanities. So.
Yeah. So, I mean, I guess the follow-up question, because since you mentioned comic books, Anna, so what put you guys on the spot? Well, first of all, when you were in the initial phases of writing these books, were you thinking about comic books? And then eventually, like, how would you say, what are some comic books for the novels that we're considering right now?
I think almost all the writers I admire reacted exactly the way Anna did. If I'm writing a novel about a pandemic, the last thing I would do is read a novel about a pandemic. First of all, I have so much nonfiction to read. But secondly, I don't want to know how somebody else did it. I'm going to be doing it myself. And part of the reason, as Anna was pointing out, all these fledgling writers are miffed when you say, what is your book like? Is you want to believe you're completely idiosyncratic, right? You want to believe you're one of a kind. And so, you finally delivered your novel to the publisher. It feels to you like this amazing achievement. And the publisher goes, so what's it like? And you're like, what do you mean, what's it like? It's like me, I'm amazing, right?
Like nothing anyone has ever seen.
Yeah, and the publisher's like, that's not so true.
Right.
And the publisher's mostly right? But when you're constructing it, you absolutely have to believe that you're in terra incognita, I think. And so, almost every writer I know, if you say, hey, there's a book just like you, they go, oh, stop. I do not want to. And you might check it out afterwards, but I often don't even do that, because if I'm working on something for 5 years about pandemics and I'm finished, guess what the last thing I want to read about is, essentially, right? I've had it with pandemics by the time
I think we all have, Jim.
Yeah. Yes, and the book buying public is saying the same thing.
So here's a question for you both. And this is a cliche question, but anyway, and I think I know the answer already, but if you had to sort of break it down, is your primary purpose as a novelist to delight or to instruct?
Wow.
Oh God, definitely delight. I don't know. I mean, I'm a journalist. So like when I've got to instruct people, like that's a much better way to go about it. Like I literally work for a website that's job is to explain the news. So if I need to like be teaching someone something, that is what I would do. And it's really true. Like I cover a lot of the same, capital I issues that come up in the book in terms of like reproductive freedom, all that kind of stuff. That's my day job. And so like, when I want to make a real like clear point, that is where I would turn. It's not that fiction can't be instructive, but I don't think it's an efficient means of instruction, and it can be an efficient means of delight if you try hard, I think. I don't know, Jim, talk about this too.
I think that's right. It can be it better be an efficient means of delighting. And I think it always has to begin with delight, because you're asking somebody to go into a new world with you. And if it does instruct, it instructs inductively rather than deductively, right? And if it has any power in that regard, it has the power to sneak around the partisan who has already decided against your position, right? So, Charles Dickens can decide that he thinks child labor laws are a very bad idea, and he can publish an essay about it, and his conservative opponents can say, well, you're a liberal. Or he can publish a novel called Hard Times and show a child doing child labor and have the conservative possibly go, well, this doesn't seem like a good idea. I don't like what's happening to this little boy, right? I mean, that's the hope, but it's a hope. And fiction's first role is to please. And if it doesn't do that, it's failed completely, essentially.
I mean, you can also like upset. Like, I feel like,
The people who love being upset are pleased in a way, right? I mean,
yeah,
you're not throwing the book across the room and then recommending it to somebody, right?
right. But like, I think exciting emotion is like the number one fiction writer job, whatever those emotions are. It's like the Aristotle, what is it, like fear and pity or something are the things that you're supposed to do in art, but according to Aristotle. So I don't know about pity, but definitely feelings.
Be compelling, right? And if you're compelling, you can get away with a protagonist like Humbert, right? As opposed to saying, as opposed to, the book club response to Humbert, which is, I just didn't think I liked him very much.
Right.
He just seemed like an unlikable person.
Well, okay, so I'm going to drill down a little bit in the same vein. So Jim and I were both, and Jim, I suppose you probably still are involved at Warren Wilson, yes?
I haven't done it in a while, but I was there.
Yeah. So anyway, it was a really great program. I was there for a while getting my MFA, and there was a lecture from a poet named David Baker, in which he talked about how all poetry can be divided into two camps, the ironic and the ecstatic. And the ecstatic poetry, the root of the word ecstatic is Greek, and it has something to do with being outside of getting out. It's sort of like an out of body experience. It has to do with like trance, dream, vision. Whereas irony, like the ironic, brings you back into your body, and it's sort of seeing the world as it is. It's humor and stuff like that. So, first of all, can fiction be divided the same way into ecstatic versus ironic, or is it more of a spectrum? And if so, where do you fall? Where do each of you fall on that spectrum of being the kind of writer that really, the goal is to transport, to create vision, dream, or the kind of reader that is trying to say something about, I'm making an artificial distinction, but you know what I mean. Where would you put yourself? First of all, do you accept that? Do you accept that premise?
About poetry or
about fiction?
No, I don't accept that about fiction. Anna, how about you?
I feel like I was having trouble thinking through like, okay, am I an ironic writer, an ecstatic writer? I do feel like the answer for me is neither. I think that this axis is not is not resonating super hard with me. But as you were talking about it, the thing that I thought about was like, when I was going to grad school, I had a friend who said, he was like, my goal in my books is to, or maybe in my book, maybe he was only had one then because we were young. He's like, my goal is to like excavate all the like most like messed up, dark, horrible aspects of myself and about humanity and put them forward for people to see and consume. Like these things that we're so ashamed of, I want to like bring them forth into the light. And then I had another good friend who was like, yeah, also me. Like when I write, I'm like taking the worst parts of myself and I'm showing them to people. And these are parts of myself I could never express like in ordinary human life. And then I remember thinking like, oh my God, maybe I'm a bad writer or whatever. I don't want to like create a straw man here either. But the point is that is when I realized that my project was trying to figure out like, how did people become heroes? And not even in the sort of, moral sense, but in the Star Trek sense or Marvel sense. Like, how did someone become a vanquisher or like an Avenger? That was what I was interested in. And I think in some ways that is always a theme that I've tried to mine. And so it's not that I'm interested in people's worst or best qualities necessarily, but I'm interested in their ability to, like, you know, I don't know, save themselves and others. So if that's an axis, and then, you know, I feel like I told that story to, like, call my friends out, but I didn't. I feel like what I'm trying to think about is an axis of, like, an axis of exorcism versus an axis of, like, aspirational or something like that, or an axis of exorcism to aspirational. And maybe I'm on the aspirational side. I don't know. That makes me sound like an Instagram influencer, which is not my favorite, but I'll stick with it.
That's really cool, though. That's a cool spectrum. Jim, what do you think?
Conceptualizing that spectrum that Anna's talking about is, if you imagine literature as all about that gap between who we are when we imagine ourselves at our very best, the aspirational, and who we so often turn out to be at our very worst, you're covering David Baker's spectrum pretty well, right? And when you're at the latter end, you're dealing with irony, right? Because you're dealing with the shortfall between who we say we are, who we hope to be, and who we just turned out to be. But when you're on the other end, you're talking about something that's pretty amazing, pretty wonderful, right? The aspirational end. And, you know, it's sort of like Auden's famous line about the poet's job is to praise all he can, praise all he can in the world for being, essentially. And on the one hand, it sounds pie in the sky. On the other hand, Auden's saying all he can, and there's stuff he can't, right? But what he can praise, he's going to praise, right? Because we are, part of what it means to be world building is to delight in those worlds, even when they're dystopian, right? It's like, well, we're alive, we're here, we're struggling, you know, we're still swinging, you know, that kind of thing.
Yeah. Well, that concludes my academic questions for the day. Really, it was interesting. I'm sad that you didn't buy into David Baker's thing, but I'm glad because it took us to a whole new continuum that we can consider. What else do you guys, we have a few minutes left. I don't see any questions from the audience, which is okay, unless there's still time. If anyone wants to type one in, this is your chance. I'd love to have a few maybe parting words, or I don't know. What do you guys think? What do you want to?
Well, Jim, the question I wanted to ask you, which is unfair, because it's a question that I've gotten asked a lot, and then I bet you've also gotten asked it a lot, but I do want to know, like, this year, what has it been like having written a pandemic novel? How has it been to, you know, watch recent events as someone who spent a lot of time thinking about this?
You know, as you might guess, on the one hand, there's something pretty surreal about watching stuff that you worked hard to sort of comprehensively imagine unfold. On the other hand, it's not as though I had to be the amazing Kreskin to pull this off, right? I mean, pretty much every epidemiologist you talk to is saying, we have a couple more serious pandemics ahead of us in the next 5 to 7 years. They've been saying that for decades and nobody's been listening. But one of the chastening things about it is you're reminded that the figure of Cassandra is, by definition, the person nobody listens to, right? That's the way it works. So you're waving your arms and you're saying, hey, we're going off a cliff. And by definition, nobody's listening. And it sort of occurs to you that that's also the way literature works, right? You know, you're waving your arms and you're saying, hey, we're going off a cliff. Even if you're celebrating, you're doing a version of that. You know, an alt-Western is saying a lot of people were hurt before we started to overturn these values. And so, you know, you want to claim that you're helping turn the boat a little bit, but you're also quite aware that this is a very big boat and it turns very slowly, if at all, right? And so this, you know, the pandemic, having a pandemic book come out during a pandemic is just a more concrete version of that in some ways, a more immediate version of that. But it does have you, you know, it does have people look at you and with an unmistakable expression of, now, why would you want to do this, essentially? And, you know, then you have to painstakingly explain that you began this project long before the pandemic and you're not just trying to make them re-examine what an awful year they had or something like that.
Right.
Anna, you've written short fiction as well, right?
A tiny bit. I don't do it as much anymore. I do flash fiction more now sometimes.
So I'm interested also in, because I know that Jim is, I know Jim's work to start out with through the short fiction, some of the amazing collections
Yeah.
that Jim has put out, Love and Hydrogen and Batting for Castro and all kinds of great stuff. But what are your thoughts on the difference between short fiction and the novel? I mean, what can the novel do that short fiction can't, and vice versa?
I can tell you why I quit writing short stories. It's because they're hard, way harder than writing a novel, so much harder. My feeling about a novel is that you can have parts that are like kind of bad. And it's like you try not to have bad parts. You're gonna like work hard to not have as few bad parts as possible. But there are times when you got to get from point A to point B and you just do it. Whereas I feel like in a short story, you really can't have any bad parts. And that started to really weigh on me. Yeah. So the difference, I think a novel for that's the difference, but for the artist, at least me, the flawed artist that is me. For the reader, it feels like the short story can capture a moment in a much more memorable way than a novel. I mean, a novel's got a lot of moments and they all accrue, and you're going to forget some of the moments in the novel, but you might not forget any of the beats in the short story. And then the thing that the novel can do that the short story can't do as easily is world building. I think there are obviously wonderful, I'm thinking of like Ursula Le Guin, who had wonderful world building in her stories. But it's way harder. It's way harder to build a convincing world in a short story. And it's harder to sort of, tell the kinds of epic sagas sometimes that you read in novels in a short story. So, those are my thoughts.
That stories have to hit the ground running, and given that there's much less furniture moving in stories than there are in novels, world building is much more done by inference. And what that means is you can do a spectacularly good story that's gesturing towards a world that's sort of strange. But if you're doing a full-on fantastic new world, it just requires too much information, right? As soon as you say, on this planet we all breathe ammonia, the reader's like, well, you got some explaining to do. And now you're in that. There's a reason I think that fantasy tends towards novels and not short stories. And the people who are attracted to fantasy want all of that, right? You're sort of like, you go, wait till you see how Hogwarts works, right? This is going to be a big fat novel because I'm going to explain how everything works. And if I just say one thing about Hogwarts, you're like, well, wait, what? Yeah. So I'm much more drawn to the form of the short story. I'm much more drawn to getting in and getting out fast and not having to do those kind of information dumps, or doing very, very selective dumps, right? I mean, so what I mean by a slightly strange world is, what was Paris during the height of the Reign of Terror like, right? It's a strange world for us, but I don't have to explain everything, right? As soon as I say, this is the world of Dune, I have 600 pages ahead of me. And in some ways, I lose patience with that before the reader does. So I'm not drawn to very, very big fat books, which is why I put less food on my children's table than I probably should.
But I mean, I will say that as short story writers go, and I don't know the universe of short story writers, but Jim, your short stories tend to be more research intensive than most.
Quite a bit, yeah.
Yeah, and in a good way.
In fact, one of my novelist friends looked at my folders of research for one story and said, "You're out of your fucking mind. I could have gotten a trilogy out of this."
Yeah. Oh, we do have a question here. Another question from Star. So maybe we can finish up with your responses to this question. What's each of your favorite revision editing advice? So what's your favorite? Let's expand it a little bit. Writing, revision, or editing advice?
Wow, favorite editing advice.
Yeah.
You go first.
Oh man.
Oh, that's good.
I'm always super impressed. This is another thing that I've learned from Instagram is like how meticulous I feel like and systematic other writers are around editing. Like I feel like I'll see a lot of novelists that I know where they'll like print out the whole draft and like put it on their floor or like on the wall and they're like charting. And that's always really impressive to me. And it's not something I can ever bring myself to do. I feel like I'm way too disorganized. My best, I'm gonna cop out on editing because I think I'm bad at it and say that my like writing advice, I try to switch up the mechanics of the writing if I'm having trouble. So that means that years ago when I was having really bad trouble, I started writing longhand. And so I started writing most of my books, at least the first draft in a notebook with a pen. That turned out to have multiple benefits because you can do it anywhere and you don't need Wi-Fi. And also then when I had a kid, it meant it was easier to write on the subway, which is a thing I was doing for a while. Now I don't take the subway as often, obviously. But yeah, so now I often write longhand, and then I find that when I get stuck, sometimes I'll turn to the computer. So that's my advice, is switch it up if you need to.
Great.
Right. One of the things I tell my students that's a useful piece of advice, I think, is after all of the other revision processes you go through and editing processes, and there are a lot of them, another one that's hugely helpful is to you have a whole draft of something, story, novel, whatever. Go to the very end of it first, read the very end of it, get that in your mind and go immediately like it's a Mobius strip around to the beginning and start reading the beginning with the end in mind as though that's where you're supposed to be going. And that essentially teaches you that on this non-linear path you've been on, you made a few swerves. Some of those swerves are probably useful. You're going to keep them in. Others, you thought you were going somewhere else at that point, right? So if you're keeping where you ended up in mind as you go back through the whole thing, suddenly you have more of a sense of what an actual complete shape looks like and whether you want the shape you've got, essentially. Boy, what useful advice.
Very good advice. I know that when it comes to editing, I went to an exhibit at the Morgan Library in New York several years ago about Hemingway, and it was really cool. You may have gone. They showed all of his kind of revisions, and actually a lot of the series that Ken Burns did recently did the same thing. And I think he revised the ending of A Farewell to Arms something like 59 times.
Well, in fact, here's an empowering anecdote for you, or advice for you. There's a book called Hemingway's First War by some hardworking scholar, came out maybe 30 years ago. And all he did was he looked at the first chapter of Hemingway's A Farewell to Arms, all the drafts, and he reprints them. And if you want to feel empowered, go check it out, because the beginning of A Farewell to Arms is one of the most beautifully written first chapters in American literature. And the first 19 drafts of it, they're just horrible. You're just watching Hemingway painstakingly make his prose into good prose. And it isn't at first, it just isn't. And he would have been, I'm sure he was spinning in his grave when those books that he hoped would never be published, like Oceans in the Stream or The Garden of Eden or whatever, were published in their 14th draft, when he was used to publishing them in his 52nd draft or something like that. But when you read, if you read the first page or two of Farewell to Arms, you think, well, I'll never write anything that good. If you read draft 31 of it, you think, I could do that. Right? And so it's very empowering. It's very cool to see.
So I mean, maybe to encapsulate that advice, it's give yourself permission to write shitty early drafts, and then revise, because I mean, what percentage of writing is revising?
Yeah. Well, I don't think you can be good until you've been bad.
Yeah.
So I have the opposite advice to that, which is Elizabeth McCracken, who was my professor in grad school. She used to tell us, she used to say, the good is the enemy of the best, which meant like you're sitting there, you're trying to write, you're like, oh, okay, maybe that one's fine. No, think about the best.
Yeah.
This haunts me all the time when I'm writing. I'm thinking about that.
Well, really, really great end to a fascinating conversation. It's certainly been fascinating for me. It's been a real privilege to be part of this and to be present in this moment. And I hope that everyone who's here feels the same. And again, click on those links to buy these books. These books, I guarantee you, knowing these writers, these books are unbelievable. So get them buy them at Antidote Books, buy them at your local bookstore, just buy them and read them and enjoy them. And other than that, I will say, and we're getting lots of thank yous and wonderful things in the chat if you guys want to look, but I will just say, Anna and Jim, it's been a real honor to be here conversing with you. And I wish you all the best for these books and for the next ones as well.
Tim, great to see you again. And Anna, lovely to finally meet you.
Thanks so much. So great to meet you both.
Be well, you guys.
Thanks, everybody.
Take care, everybody.
Bye-bye.